We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeoanimal Podcast, a podcast all about zooarchaeology and the relations between humans and animals in the past. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 17 of the Archaeoanimals Podcast. I'm Alex Fitzpatrick, and with me as always,
Simona Falanga.
And today we are talking about the holidays and feasting and all the other good stuff.
And we really hope that Alex has eaten beforehand this time. Otherwise it'll be really difficult to get through. Oh, God.
I haven't eaten yet. I'm sorry. But hey, listen, it's the holidays. Now, hopefully when you're listening, it is the holidays. And more importantly, happy 5th birthday, Archaeo Podcast Network.
Woohoo!
We did it. Well, not we, because we've only been part of the podcast network for like a year. But like...
Episode 13, so
we
what?
Contributed.
I'm going to put myself on the spot with my bad math now. A year, 5 months.
Something like that, yeah. But, but a great time for anyone who's listening to us to also listen to some other podcasts on the network or become a member or support us in any other way. It's a good anniversary.
Because it's a celebration of sorts. I guess that calls for a feast.
Yay. So yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about today. We'll be talking about feasting and the archaeological record, since obviously feasts often have to do with animals. And I guess that's our jurisdiction. And also I love food. So
yes, I guess the first thing that'd be worth mentioning, so what is the difference between feasting and just your regular consumption, your evening tea? Think about feasting. Over the years, we've had numerous different definitions that have been put forward. So if we listed all of them, we'd probably just take up half the episode. So I think personally, correct me if I'm wrong, what is key to remember here is that feasting involves a gathering of people, and then as Wiesner notes, should ideally extend beyond a household. And these people gather within a formal or semi-formal setting. And of course, this all revolves around or includes the consumption of food.
I mean, I would refer to me eating by myself as feasting because it's a huge deal. But, I guess that makes sense too.
Well, I guess treat yourself is also a feast in its own right.
I mean, that's a feast I do all the time. But yeah, feasting, even though feasting has this kind of connotation as being like a religious thing or a ritual thing, especially when we're thinking about archaeology, it could also be secular. I mean, think of feasting today, obviously. It could be celebration. It could just be a surplus of food, as that, could be rare back then.
Exactly. Could just simply be Granddad's birthday.
Yeah. And it can be determined by the kind of deposition nature. If it's more ritualized, then you're probably looking at a feasting context.
But not necessarily, because that's the beauty of archaeology.
There's always a but in archaeology. That should be a t-shirt. Just saying.
Context is everything.
Putting it out there. Context is everything. There's always a but in archaeology.
But now, how do we actually recognize feasting in the archaeological record? I guess so the key marker here is, of course, you have a single deposition of a high quantity of animal bone.
Which is where, our podcast comes in. Because obviously, if you're looking at a pit, there's loads of a specific animal or a specific part of an animal, the meaty bits, quote unquote. You're definitely looking at some kind of feasting or feasting adjacent activity that was going on there.
If you're still picturing that pit in your mind and say it's been backfilled with material in a single event, and there's a load, which is the correct scientific measurable term, a load of animal bone in there that's been deposited in a single event, chances are it was probably a large number of people that have been eating at the same time. Or myself, because I will happily eat all of the food. So
same.
It's either an archaeological Simona or a gathering of people.
There's no judgment on this podcast.
No, you eat as much as you like.
Feasting can be a communal or a singular event here on the Archaeo Animals podcast.
Exactly. And as you said, then you will tend to mostly find higher sort of meat-bearing joints. But that's where the other but comes in. Because, of course, on certain sites, you tend to find a wider range of meat joints, not necessarily bearing a high amount of meat, because, of course, that also depends on how egalitarian the society we're looking at was. So you may find an incidence of very nice meaty bits that the elite will be eating and then what everyone else will be eating. Yep.
Pig feet.
It's a mixed bag.
Literally.
While usually feasting does center around meat, you do tend to find grains and other sort of non-meat material in the form of residue found on ceramics.
Yeah, this is where...
Of course, drinks, beer.
Yeah. This is where this episode of the podcast is going to be a little kind of out of our jurisdiction because, you really can't talk about feasting without also mentioning those like non-animal bits because they make such a big part of the feast. Believe me, I will eat a all-meat feast as many times as I can, but, there's other parts as well.
I guess there is a bias in its own right for us to even say that feasting sort of revolved around mostly meat consumption. Because that very definition is biased because the animal bone is what is most likely to survive. And for all you know, that society might have had loads of veg and only a small amount of animal, of meat, but you're not going to find the veg.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably talk about that later in the episode. Yeah, so we're definitely not going to, just focus on the animal bits. Although, of course, we will talk about them. So if we're still talking about animal bits, of course, one of the other things we can use to recognize feasting in the archaeological record is kind of the taxa or the kinds of species that you find within these groups. So more unusual species when compared to like the average consumption profile of the ones available. That might be a bit of a clue.
Yeah, and of course, not just taxa itself, but even if the age and sex of the animals differs from the usual pattern of consumption for that particular society. There's, for instance, you may have instances of sort of feasting with a higher incidence of juveniles. So if you think of like Roman suckling pigs being considered a delicacy, you probably find a lot more juveniles than if you're looking, say, at an agrarian society, finding a large amount of valuable adults, so say like milking cows in their prime, which would be considered a substantial loss for that society, but it's all that showing that wealth, that celebration where you're willing to lose that material wealth in terms of your highly prized cows, which again suggests a celebration of sorts and thus a more or less ritualized feasting.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the more ritualized aspects, the context, again, we already talked about this, it's all about the context, baby. But when you think of the context specifically, spatially, where is the proximity of this deposit to, say, funerary features or monuments, as opposed to, say, a settlement? These could all be different indicators of feasting. And I think that will actually come into play in a little bit later, especially when we talk about kind of individual case studies.
Then I guess in terms of species, I'm not sure whether there's specific species that are a dead giveaway for feasting. Because you do tend to, it really varies on tradition and culture. So, of course, what you tend to find more commonly will be domesticates. Of course, if you're talking about agrarian societies, but you do tend to find wild animals, fish. It's a mixed bag, really.
Yeah, you could basically either be your average domesticates or everything else. So basically anything. I don't know why I tried to limit this by species, but yeah, when thinking about it, it could be anything depending on what culture you're dealing with.
So, which brings us to why would people in the past feast? Because the most obvious reason is why not, and treat yourself.
Exactly.
But as in more scientifically measurable, sort of, I guess you'll have celebrations, which again don't necessarily have to be religious, because it can be a celebration to mark a specific day in the year. So you can have your first harvest, or following the lunar cycles, or even if the celebration is not maybe directly linked with the lunar cycle, you will find even in the ethnographic record that the feasting will take place around a particular lunar cycle, if that makes sense. Then, of course, you have your usual sort of, life transitions, so birth, coming of age, marriage, death, and then, of course, you have all of your, highly ritualized and religious aspect to it, sort of like sacrifices and, more structured religious celebrations.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not necessarily a specific thing. Like we said earlier, sometimes feasting comes from just a surplus. If, say, the society that we're looking at only deals with a specific preservation process that isn't in place at the time, so meat won't keep for long. Having a feast doesn't only prevent waste, but you have the idea of forming bonds, alliances, that solidarity.
It just basically just states that there's no such thing as free lunch, even in the archaeological record. It's an interesting way of looking at it as well. Of course, it's not only sort of economically wise in a way that you don't waste the surplus that you've hunted, but you're actually, and in a way, it does to this day, because you meet some people and you really enjoy their company. So what you do, maybe you invite them round for dinner, and maybe it might not be as like having an aim in mind, like you want to form an alliance per se, but you might want to invite them around for dinner because you want to get to know them better. You want them to be your friend. You form a bond. It could be just something as simple as that. We still do it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, if you want to get really scientific, we have scholars like Hastorf, whose work we will put in the show notes, who has kind of just created three main categories that feasting kind of falls in. So you have the celebratory / communal feast, which we've kind of already covered, but also Hastorf specifically says that it's a feast where everyone's treated equally, everyone's getting, a certain amount of food, stuff like that. It's a celebration. Then you have the patron / client category, which means that there's clearly a giver and receiver defined. There's clearly someone who is providing a lot of the food for a person who's being honored, who is, the most important person there, things like that. And then you have the status / display feast, which is all about showcasing the kind of wealth and power you had. Like you were saying before, Simona, showing off, I can butcher these animals and it's fine. I can eat these and make them for a feast and it won't affect me whatsoever because I have this kind of wealth and power.
Yeah, I think one thing that's associated with that as well, or in some societies at least, I can't think of any particular examples off the top of my head, but it's also the association of animal skulls on top of sort of like the bones that are associated with feasting.
Oh.
Do you think some of the interpretations whether the animal skulls were actually used as decorations?
Yeah, no, that actually makes sense. I've never really thought of it like that. I don't think I've ever really come across skulls in that sense, but yeah, that would make sense.
Because especially if you've been on a big hunt and you've hunted like these massive like stags, of course, you would want to put like a red deer stag skull on display. Like it has quite an effect on people.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely feel affected if I came in for Christmas dinner and my parents had just put turkey skulls everywhere. Just saying. Actually, I'd be hyped. I would be so hyped because I'd be like, are those for me? Oh my gosh. You finally accept me.
Yeah, and then you can use them as a reference for all the turkey that you're not going to find in Britain.
Yep. Anyway, so, now that we've talked about why people would feast, where would they feast? And that's actually something we kind of covered. Depending on what kind of feast you're dealing with, it could be a communal space, it could be a ritually important space. I mean, there's some instances of feasts being held in burial grounds and tombs, those kind of funerary areas, which, I think today seems kind of strange, but, that was accepted culture. And it happens.
One thing that I do wonder about some of what have been interpreted as funerary feasts within a burial ground, I wonder if we can be absolutely sure that it was the living that consumed that feast sort of within the burial ground and then buried what was left of it, or whether it was actually meat joints thrown in a pit sort of within a burial ground as an offering, and none of the food was actually consumed.
That's actually a really
because
good
unless
point.
you get some very specific taphonomic factors lined up, you won't really be able to tell that from the deposit. I think at most, you might be able to get a slightly darker deposit showing some decaying organic matter.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's, yeah.
I mean, I guess it's that kind of thing we have, especially in zooarchaeology, of that kind of bias of, everything needs to have a logical reason for being, so logically you would think, there's animal bones here that were clearly butchered and cooked. People ate that here. And modern day ideas of illogical wasting of food, do you know what I mean?
But in a way, it makes sense in a way, because in our funerary tradition, in many funerary traditions, you do sometimes leave things. Well, you essentially do it today as well. You leave grave goods.
Yeah.
For people, and it might have been an object that they've cherished during their lives. It might be something that you donate to them. How about a lamb leg? I
mean, I would probably eat the lamb leg and not give it to my grandpa, but that's me.
Well, that's not very nice.
I'm hungry. I think with that, we might have to take a break where I'll contemplate the fact that I have no food right now, and we will get back at it.
And that Alex doesn't share food.
What can I say?
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ANIMALS.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. To serve others in ways that promote human flourishing and create a ripple effect of transformation for generations to come. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
And we're back with Archaeo Animals, and we are talking about feasting and holidays and all the other good stuff. So for this segment of the podcast, I figured we could talk a bit about, how people would feast. So speaking archaeologically, something's really never changed. People would feast by being in groups of people who may be blood related, they may be an extended group, they may be part of their community. Sometimes things would be sacrificed or offered to the gods, the spirits, whatever more supernatural aspects that they may or may not believe in. And all these other kind of ritualized activities might happen as well, which we do today. So, we say grace before we eat, we exchange gifts, we make speeches, toasts, things like that. I mean, some things really don't change. And I think that's why we also wanted to talk about our own feasting traditions, I guess. So, Simona, you want to talk a bit about what you do during the holidays?
I guess my favourite sort of holiday meal is what we traditionally eat on Christmas Eve. So now, in Sicily, and again, I'm not sure whether that applies to the rest of Italy. I know it's the case in Germany as well. But in Sicily, we eat seafood and fish on Christmas Eve. Now, that's more than likely a Catholic thing, because I believe Christmas Eve was originally a day of abstinence from meat, and there was this weird thing where fish is not meat, apparently.
Oh, yeah.
So we eat fish. The prominent dishes, generally, although not particularly in my family, are what we called pesce stocco bacala. Now, pesce stocco is stockfish, and bacala is pretty much salt-dried cod. And the name we have for it is nothing like the name we have for cod. It's just this very specific name that is salt-dried cod. What we tend to have generally, we have like a seafood salad, primarily with octopus being the main ingredient, which I know like people really look at me really funny when I mention this in Britain. It's like, what do you mean you eat octopus?
Sounds great.
And we tend to have sort of grilled king prawns and seafood pasta. So in the imaginary archaeological record of my Christmas Eve meal, because you'll probably find, not of my family specifically, but you'll find the fish bones of cod and whatever stockfish bones look like. Please write us about it. You'll find if the preservation of the soil, like if you have the right taphonomic factors, you'd find the shells of the mussels and the clams that tend to be in the pasta and in the seafood salad that we eat. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to get the pasta, much of the pasta, or the king prawn shells or anything in it. You might get food residue in the vessels, possibly.
Yeah.
But not much aside
probably.
from that. One thing that you may also be able to get in the archaeological record, if preservation is real good, are the octopus beaks. Because octopi. Octopi have beaks.
Octopi.
Yeah. They have
Sounds great.
They have beaks at the bottom, and they can give you a really nasty bite, by the way. And this beak is composed primarily of a material called chitin, which I may have just mispronounced, and cross-linked proteins. Now, this chitin, from what I've gathered, is something that generally you find in the cell walls of mushrooms and as part of the exoskeleton of arthropods.
Yeah, I know it mostly from Skyrim.
The chitin or the octopus.
The chitin. You get it from the worm things that the Falmer have.
All right.
Everything I learned is from video games, guys. I'm smart.
Might have to have another video game episode on instead of the zoo archaeology of video game creatures, we could cover the zoo archaeology of video game meals.
Yeah, but that sounds really good. And I was going to say, actually, from my Italian American friends, I think seafood on Christmas Eve is definitely a thing. At least the Italian Americans seem to still practice that, from my experience.
It's probably a Catholic thing.
Maybe, yeah. I don't know. It always sounded nice for me, to be completely honest. Actually, my family used to do seafood for Christmas Eve as well, but that's because we used to go to our family friend's restaurant, which was a seafood restaurant, and we would get a good deal.
Yeah, I guess, as I said, I'm not sure exactly what the origin is of the seafood meal, but taste is good. Fine by me.
Yeah, fair enough. So As for my kind of traditions, some of you guys who listen may know, especially if you follow me on social media, because I don't shut up about it. I am from a mixed family. So we have a lot of blended traditions during the holidays. So one of them that we tend to do, especially for Christmas Day, is from the Norwegian side of my family. We make a lot of baked goods, Norwegian baked goods like julekake and icebox cakes and all those kinds of stuff. It's just loads of baked goods everywhere, which I know isn't just, specifically a Norwegian thing, but it's nice. And it's a nice way to also talk about kind of another component of feasting that we don't really see archaeologically, which is the idea of baked goods. Because, you're not really going to find baked goods as preserved as, say, animal bones or remains or whatever. But, occasionally you do find grains and cereals and charred bits here and there. Earlier this year, I believe, they found what is being called the world's oldest bread. It was found in Jordan. It's about 14,440 years old. And it was basically these charred remains, and it was analyzed with scanning electron microscopy. And they use all this other criteria that apparently archaeobotanists have to use when looking at grains to consider whether or not it's actually from a baked good like bread. I think they actually got it down to flatbread specifically, which is wild. Yeah, so they found this old flatbread, and it's kind of amazing that you can, by looking at the specific grains and cereals, you can say this is what this was specifically used for. Oh, and also the 3,000-year-old butter that was found in the peat bog that I think a lot of memes used.
Oh, that must have gone off by now.
I mean, I would definitely try it.
You try most things, so that's... I'm
tempting God. I don't know what that means. Anyway, because we have to make it all about me, I have a second thing. Sorry, Simona. But I'm also Chinese. My mother is from China. And so another part of our blended traditions is we have a lot of Chinese rice dishes and dim sum dishes, which is like a brunch type of dish that you'd have dumplings and stuff with. And we specifically have this with my Chinese grandparents. And that's kind of a nice way to talk a bit more about who you eat with. So in Chinese culture, especially, ancestor worship and veneration is really important. And we even see this as far back as the Shang dynasty. There have been bronze vessels that have been found, and you see these worshippers that are offering wine and soup and fruits to their ancestors. And this is some of the earliest depictions of feasting we have, generally speaking. And actually, in the Shang dynasty, in the late Shang dynasty, graveside feasting became pretty important. So you would basically be, at the graveside of your ancestors, and you would feast there. And something that's really interesting about this is that it kind of differs from the categories we were talking about before, as we're not trying to get the alliance or the help or the aid of a living person, but of the dead. So, I thought that was really interesting. And kind of wish we still did that, to be honest. That would be cool.
Yeah, I think these days, eating at the cemetery is frowned upon.
Yeah, I know. But I want to get, my great mama or yaya to help me in the Grand War.
With the PhD.
Yes, definitely with a PhD. Anyway, not enough about me. We also actually asked listeners, all you out there, about your own traditions. And we've got a few of them that we wrote down.
Because the first one that comes up, as you'd expect, is beer. Now, of course, even though it's not recovered very frequently in the archaeological record, it is highly likely that alcohol probably formed an important part of feasting in many cultures. Now, of course, most of what you'd find is, again, residue in vessels, because it can preserve sometimes if the stars align. So what you do usually tend to find with beer is more the residue and grains from the beer making process. So I think there is actually evidence of the first British beer that was found in Cambridgeshire, which contained barley, water and oats.
I'm so glad you said that, because I did not know how to pronounce Cambridgeshire. Cambridgeshire. Everything's got weird names here.
Try and pronounce Loughborough for me.
No, I won't. Well, something really interesting about beer, though, is I like that we've kind of had the reversed happen in terms of where there's a lot of breweries, especially in places like Scotland and like the Orkneys, who are trying to recreate older beer recipes and alcohol recipes that we've found in texts and, from archaeological record. It's really cool. I actually had some of them before. I had like one that was based on like Orcadian traditions. It was like heather beer or something like that. It was actually pretty nice.
Yeah, I think they've done something similar with traces of wine that was found in food vessels in Sicily, I believe, dating to the Roman period.
Yeah, that sounds...
And I think someone out there has tried to recreate wine.
Anything you can do to make a buck, I guess.
Then, of course, another big one that's popped up from our listeners, of course, is roast meat.
I think every other comment we had mentioned a roast of some kind. So if it was turkey or chicken, all these kinds of food, that was like the centerpiece of their feast.
Yeah, just like ribs, I think, popped out a fair amount as well, I believe. But yeah, and that again has largely remained unchanged. And the archaeological record, you will similarly find the joints of meat, with burn marks, taphonomic marks in the way of the meal has been portioned, or even maybe like slicing marks of the way the meat joint has been filleted, just so to get the last bits of meat out. And heat exposure marks, which of course, let's say if it was like a leg joint, you'll have the extremities that will be more heat exposed, because that when you have the least meat, and the joint that bore the most meat, of course, still being heat affected, but of course nowhere near as much as the proximal and distal ends, say, that would be completely charred.
Yeah. And like we were saying before, it'd also be probably, I don't know if the easiest is the best word to use, but it's going to be one of the more remaining bits of a feast in the archaeological record. There's so many other aspects of feast that we've been talking about that will degrade and not be there by the time archaeologists get to these sites. And animal bones, of course, will stand the test of time a little bit better. So, yeah. Oh, gosh, I'm thinking about ribs right now.
So, like, taking it away from the ribs, veggies.
Let's talk about something healthy-ish, veggies and fruits. So a lot of listeners chimed in with a lot of side dishes that have to do with veggies and fruits. We had a lot of people talk about roast and baked veg. Of course, a lot of people talk about cranberry sauce, especially in America. We've got our fruit pies, which will always be superior to the meat pie. And as we said before, these are things that won't necessarily survive in the archaeological record.
I'll tell you what kind of pie I was really confused about when I moved here. Mince pies. So I'd expected them, okay, so there's salty pies with minced beef. No.
Yeah.
Got raisins. Why'd you lie to me?
Yeah, right? It's really weird. And I mean, it's okay. I've never really liked it, but I've only really had mince pies from like the corner shop or like the pub.
I guess it's probably not the best representation of mince pie.
Probably not.
I don't like raisins anyway, so
that's fair. But yeah, no, these are things that aren't necessarily going to survive in the archaeological record. You'll get your trace elements in vessels like we've been talking about. Never underestimate the power of residue and grains, apparently. But a lot of what we find can be found in, artwork that are depicting these feasts. Like I was talking about before with the Shang Dynasty vessels, there are so many depictions of feasting that really help in our interpretations, because so much of that won't last. And also in text, especially as you get a little bit further into the timeline, a lot of early historians writing about these kind of things. They're super helpful.
Yeah. But then, of course, if you're dealing with the prehistoric period where, say, there wasn't a lot of even sort of depictions or artwork found, well, good luck.
Yeah, it's a little bit. That's when you get a little bit more like imagination.
although the works have been made, I think there's a book out there. Well, I'll try to find, because I don't remember the exact title. I'll try to find and put it in the show notes. But there's a book that's entirely dedicated to prehistoric cooking in Britain.
Huh.
And it gives you actual recipes. So I guess maybe a lot of those are from the later Iron Age, so they maybe looked at Roman sources. I'm not too sure, but yeah, it's someone's put the work in.
Better than me. And kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, especially as someone who's a bit, like I like witchy stuff in general, is herbs. So we actually had some people mention herb kind of base, well, not herb base, but like herb dishes in terms of paprika, baked onions. You had panzerotti with cinnamon, and it just got me thinking how important herbs are that we don't really talk about, especially if we're talking about ritualized activities. There's instances of herbs that have been burnt, probably to mask smells, especially if you're dealing with like the funerary type of things, or to invoke smells as well that are related to whatever you're actually doing, and how these herbs can correlate with certain concepts or deities. So, it's all these pieces of the feast really correlate together to make an experience, I guess. Now I sound like I'm trying to sell a new restaurant.
Have a feast. It's always a good time for a feast. Have you had your feast yet?
It's an experience. Speaking of experiences, we're going to go experience a break, and we'll be back after this.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
And we're back with Archeo Animals, and today we are talking about feasting and holidays, and basically just food in general. This is an excuse to talk about a lot of food. And actually, over the break, Simona, you just found out what that book was that we were talking about before.
Yes, the title of the book is Food and Farming in Prehistoric Britain by P. Elliott, and I've put the full reference down in the show notes for those who are interested in looking at that.
Yeah, and also let us know if you want us to do an episode about this, because, it might be fun to do an episode about trying to recreate prehistoric meals.
Yeah, I could try to follow the recipes and then try them live.
Yeah, then I'll finally be able to eat something while we record. We fixed it. We solved the greatest problem of all time.
That's why I've got a master's degree.
Same. Anyway, it's everyone's favorite part of the podcast. We're up to case studies. Although I guess realistically, this whole episode's been case studies, now that I think about it.
Much, and even like a case study unto ourselves.
Yeah,
we've
that's deep.
Case study.
We have become what we speak of. I don't know.
Oh, meta.
We are very meta. Anyway, starting off, I'm actually going to revisit something that we talked about before. For those of you who listened to our episode on pigs, you might remember we talked a bit about the Stonehenge feasts and how there are these just huge amounts of pig remains have been interpreted as the people who were, creating and building Stonehenge. This is what they were eating. And I know we talked about that in terms of pigs, but I kind of want to talk a bit more about, the mechanics of feasting, if that makes sense. Like the fact that Stonehenge is clearly a place where loads of people were going to be there and also going to help build these places. It kind of makes sense that they would have a kind of a communal feasting as part of that entire, activity or ritualized activity,
Oh, absolutely.
And we have to talk about Stonehenge. That's what every archaeologist needs to talk about, Stonehenge. I'm sorry.
You talk about Stonehenge. You go ahead.
I'm just really interested in the idea of, because of course Stonehenge is this big thing, like weird abstract concept, especially with archaeologists, of like, oh, it was this weird ritual thing, or the aliens made it, or whatever. And I feel like no one really talks about, the mechanics of like, yeah, these were a lot of people who were meeting here, and they probably ate, had these big feasts. And that's why I'm really glad that this kind of research has been coming out about, the kind of food they've been eating, because it's something that kind of grounds the Stonehenge conversation a bit more for me.
Oh, no, absolutely. In a way, that's what I find more interesting, because as spectacular as Stonehenge may be, it doesn't tell you an awful lot about the people.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Because personally, the reason I do this, I want to reconstruct the lives of the people, not the big funerary complex, or not of the 1%, but of the people.
You heard it here, folks.
If that makes sense.
We are archaeology for the people, truly. We're going to tear down Stonehenge. No, I'm not strong. I'm not that strong. I can't do it. I'm sorry. But yeah, no, that's kind of just what I want to talk about with Stonehenge. But yeah, I would also love to go to a Stonehenge feast. I feel like there's a world out there where people don't do ridiculous things, and we could have feasts at Stonehenge still. That'd be nice.
Do they have feasts in the summer solstice, maybe?
I mean, like an actual feast, not just like people standing around and like eating a meal deal.
It can be anything can
That's
be a feast.
true. Yeah, I know. I'm now being judgmental. I'm so sorry. But yeah, no, it would be nice. Like, those like we were talking about before, those dining experiences. I'm surprised they haven't had dining experiences at Stonehenge.
Well, because on the one hand, it's like, please don't eat off the archaeology.
But what if we did?
Just, if you must.
As someone who has definitely eaten like a chocolate bar over archaeology before,
Oh, you heard it here.
Yeah.
You heard
This is
it
why I'm
here.
not going to get any work. Anyway, I believe you have a real hot take in our next case study.
Oh, I've got a can of worms.
No, not even a hot
for
take.
Our case study.
You got a can of worms. That's even worse.
So like,
Let's do it. Come on.
All right, okay. So my can of worms for this month is what we know as Coswade enclosures. Now, I'm going to be providing a lot of context for this, because I feel that Coswade enclosures are not something that are terribly well known even within archaeological circles.
I have no idea what a causeway enclosure is. Just saying.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So, a Coswade enclosure is a Neolithic monument that is found on the British Isles. Now, they're not exclusive to Britain, because these are also found on the mainland Europe, but these tend to date from 5,000 to 4,200 BC, and then you sort of see them moving, like reaching Western and Northern Europe, and then eventually Britain some 500 to 1,000 years later, which in itself raises some interesting questions about shifting social and economic dynamics in Britain at the time. But that's a story for another day. The point with Coswade enclosures is that they're not very common, as in, like, they're not uncommon, but they're not common, if you know what I mean.
No, absolutely not.
Either way, I think in the statistics that have been done, the total is shy of 120 Coswade enclosures across the British Isles. The vast majority of them are located in England. You have a few in Scotland. I believe there's 2 in Scotland, 2 in Wales, or maybe 3 in Scotland, 2 Wales, 2 in Ireland, and 1 on the Isle of Man. So, yeah, 120, well, just under 120. So, they're not completely unheard of. There's a fair few, but it's not terribly common either. Now, the feature itself, it's an oval or circular feature, of course, a quite substantial diameter, and it's formed by one or more discontinuous ditch and bank systems. So, if you will, there's sort of like an entranceway, or like an entrance to sort of navigate your way within all the various ditches and banks. Sometimes these features were palisaded, and you normally see that because timber doesn't really preserve in Britain, what you'd find in the archaeological record are rows of post holes. The post hole being sort of the man-made cut that has been made into the ground to then insert the wooden post and then pack it around with whatever, be it rubble or more soil.
The post hole is by far one of the most important archaeological artifacts in Britain, from my experience at least.
Yeah, and one of the most frustrating at that too, especially when there's a whole row of them. The thing about Coswade enclosures is that to this date, I'm not sure we've really agreed on what they were for, or what sort of function they may have represented, or what really went on inside of these enclosures. What we do know is that largely they are non-funerary in nature, which in a way it makes Coswood enclosures the earliest form of non-funerary monument on the British Isles.
So they're like an early Stonehenge, now I understand.
Yeah. So surely there are burials of Stonehenge, aren't there? But they're later.
I think so. Yeah, something like that. I was just making a bad joke.
Yeah, I think that's the case for Coswood, because I think some do have burials, but they tend to be of later date. But anyway.
That's interesting, yeah.
The reason I'm rambling on about Coswood enclosures is that, as it may surprise no one, what we do know is that some feasting did happen within these enclosures, based on the evidence that we've been recovering from the ditch deposits. So what you find, so the ditches appear for the most part to have been backfilled with this very sort of dark midden-like deposit. And I think, as I've mentioned earlier, sort of in archaeology, when you encounter a deposit that is very dark in colour, that can sort of be owing to sort of a higher incidence of charcoal within the fill, but it could also be due to decaying organic matter within the fill. And of course, you know, that's very same technical load of animal remains. It tends to be very mixed in terms of the species that are recovered, although on some sites, so like on the Coswood enclosure at Hambledon Hill in Dorset, there's a high incidence of cattle, for example. More than that, it does tend to be a bit of a mix. And what you do tend to find as well is pottery, usually smashed to bits, which are presumed as of now to be potential storage vessels. So, of course, the assumption here is that this deposited material is directly linked to the activity that was taking place inside the enclosure. Because, don't quote me on this, but I believe that these Coswood enclosures are not spatially located necessarily near a settlement. So I guess it'll be very weird to have a feast at the settlement, and then you bring all these bags of bones, and then you go chuck them in the Coswood enclosure. I mean, they might have done. But probably not.
Weirder things have happened.
So, of course, you know, because of the high quantity of it and the way the deposit looks, there is evidence for deliberate backfill. And what's also interesting about it is that this backfill is sometimes very organized, and you do have evidence for numerous recuts. So in archaeology, sort of when we talk about recuts, we mean so you have your ditch, and your ditch, in this particular case, gets manually backfilled with this material, the residue material from feasting. So it gets filled up, but then after a while, it gets cut again. So that material gets shoveled out once more, so the ditch is in use again, and then it gets backfilled again, and then they cut it out again sometime later, and it just keeps going on. So you do tend to see a series of recuts, which in a way also implies a kind of maintenance of the structure. For example, you see that a lot in, so say, even something as simple as sort of irrigation systems. Because, of course, because of the water going through them, they will silt up. They will have erosion coming in from all sides. It will fill up quicker than you expect. And then you'll find a recut when they'll try to clear up the silt. But, of course, you, like, without necessarily meaning to, you recut the feature. And then when you excavate it, you're actually able to see that by looking at the archaeology, like, if the feature has been recut or maintained over time or not. So yeah, I think with Coswood enclosure, because it's just something, so like they're not very well known. If you do want to learn more about these features, there's actually a whole open access book, which was actually my main source for the case study. And that's available on the Archaeology Data Service. And I've got to go put a link in the show notes. So if I've left you wanting for more Coswood enclosures, so there's a whole book about them.
You were very hyped about this book.
Woo!
It's super interesting, to be fair.
Sorry, it's just when I go off on one, it's the Roman taxation system all over again.
To be fair, it's what
just going with the flow.
It's what the audience wants. This is the third segment is often the case studies / Simona's tangent section, and I would never have it any other way, to be honest.
Oh, thank you. So hopefully educational tangent.
I was actually going to say, me reaching back into the dark dark corners of my mind when I used to be a classical archaeologist. I think, I don't know if you can attest to this, Simona, something similar with some Etruscan tombs. Like, I vaguely remember there being a thing of these kind of the entryways into these tombs being backfilled and often having the kind of rubbish that you associate with feasting as well mixed into them, I think.
I don't remember that specifically. Of course, like, it would make sense, and it would make sense to see a recut of so the rubble being taken out, because the Etruscan tumuli were in use for over a long period of time, because they tended to be sort of big family graves. So you would go in to deposit sort of another body, and by you, I mean, like, not the family, the slave would go in to add another body sort of on the stone beds that they had within the tumulus. And then when you ran out of room, you just took the oldest bone and you just started sticking it on the walls.
Yeah.
as you do.
As you do.
But they would have been used for a long period of time, because some of them were quite large. Because again, and that links back to feasting in a way as well, as this whole sort of showing wealth. So even in Etruscan society, sort of like the bigger, the better. Because you would show that, like, you know, you were wealthy because you could build big tumuli, and they would have celebrations sort of within the funerary area. So yeah, I guess what you said, it makes perfectly good sense. And then you'd find sort of feasting material sort of within the entranceway of the structures.
Yeah, and I like that, actually, you mentioning that brings it back around to the idea that you were talking about before, in that when you find feasting remains in these kind of funerary areas, how do we know they were actually, you know, feasting for the living? And there's that idea of, if feasting is a form of status, wealth, performativeness, how that could even go into the afterlife, in that, you know, this person is such high status that they are able to have this feast, which is not for any of the living people. It's what they're taking with them, which is actually really interesting.
That in Egyptian archaeology. So I think, like, bodies have been recovered in the dynastic period with entire, like, joints of meat just been there in their graves.
See, this is why I'm not an ancient Egyptian archaeologist, because I would probably just start chowing down.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's much left of the meat joints. And if it is,
you know,
the 10 out of 10 would not recommend eating.
You know, you have to have higher ambitions, really.
Eating ancient Egyptian meat joints.
I mean, like, you don't know. Could be good. I could be starting a trend. A horrible trend. Oh. Yeah, that's bad. But yeah, no. Is there anything else you want to add about feasting before we take this to the close?
Best not.
That's true. We don't have time for another hour-long segment, I guess. But yeah, no, for anyone listening when we release this episode, we hope you all have a good holiday, regardless of what you are celebrating or not celebrating. Just, you know, enjoy the times. Enjoy the end of the year, stuff like that. And once again, please join us in wishing the Archaeology Podcast Network a happy birthday. Why not give the gift of archaeology this year, as it is the holiday / giving season? You know, tell your friends and family about this really great podcast about dead animals. You know you want to.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, come on. I tried. Anyway, that's been us. It's been another episode of Archaeoanimals. Happy holidays. Happy birthday to ArcPodNet. Yeah. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Archaeoanimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. You can find us on Twitter at Archaeoanimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.